Thanks for joining me on my YouTube channel. This is Caleb Warnock. I'm the best-selling author of 14 books, including The Art of Baking with Natural Yeast, co-written with Melissa Richardson. And in this YouTube video, I'm going to teach you how to keep a natural baking yeast starter to make waffles, pancakes, muffins, bread, artisan bread, any of the recipes that you find in our book, or recipes that you make yourself. So, thanks for joining me, and Bake with Health. This is how we're going to help you get started. In this video, I'm going to teach you what to do once you get yeast. If you go to my website, seedrenaissance.com, you can get natural yeast mailed to you, free natural yeast that is dried. It's dried flakes like this. And this you can get for free by going to seedrenaissance.com and clicking on the free offers tab. Or you can go to the website and you can purchase live yeast for $5, and it will come to you in a package like this. And the difference between live yeast and dried yeast is that live yeast is ready to go. By the time it gets to you, it'll be hungry, it'll be ready to eat, and you can start making volumes of live yeast, which is what this is. And you know that it's ready to use because it's filled full of bubbles of all different kinds of sizes. If you're using dried yeast, the dried yeast is going to have to wake up. And so you'll need to mix this and feed it, and it will take a few days longer for this dried yeast to wake up. So I'm going to show you what to do, whichever one of these you're using. We're going to start with the dried yeast. What we've learned, I've taught a lot of people about yeast now, and we've learned that there are some ways that are better to do this than others. And because everyone's chlorine level is different depending on the city that you live in, I suggest that you use non-chlorinated water, and you can purchase purified water out of the grocery store, or you can let some of your tap water sit out for about 48 hours. And then you simply take these yeast flakes. You don't need to use all of them. I know that what's in here doesn't look like a lot, but this is actually enough to start many batches of yeast. And you could just take even a few of those flakes. Oops, I dropped it. And if you can see, we just have flakes sitting in water. And swirl those around just a little bit, and then add some flour. I use home ground whole wheat flour, red wheat flour. That's what I use at my house. I just grind it myself in a machine. And then you're just going to stir this together, and the key to mixing this together is that you want it to be like a thick batter. You don't want it to be runny. The yeast is going to be happier if it is a thick batter. Obviously you don't want it to be too thick, but I'm just mixing this together with a spatula. All this is flour and water and those little dried yeast flakes. And we want it to be fairly mixed up. And then once this is correctly mixed, it'll be somewhat thick. And you can see that it does not fall very quickly off of the spatula, and that's exactly the consistency that we want. It's fairly thick. Now you'll put a lid on here loosely, and you'll just let this sit on the counter at room temperature. Do not put it in the fridge. Let it sit on the counter at room temperature until it fills full of bubbles that look like this. Bubbles of all different sizes. And as soon as it's got bubbles of all different sizes, that means that those dried yeast flakes are now awake and ready to be used. You can see that it's kind of dense. There's a few little air bubbles in there, but this is the stuff we've just mixed. And if you leave it on the counter, it will turn into this at room temperature. Because they're dried, this could take several days for this to happen. Depending on the temperature in your house, this could take several days. If you are ordering from me the $5 live yeast, then the process is exactly the same. You take a little bit of your non-chlorinated water And it doesn't matter how much you put in. In the beginning, I suggest that you use a small amount while you practice growing this yeast. And then you open the package that you're going to get from me in the mail, and you just take out, you don't even need to take out very much of this yeast. Just take out some of the yeast from the package, a little bit, and mix it into the water that's in the jar, like this, until, you have to remember that yeast is a living organism, and there are millions of yeasts in here. And I just swirl it like this until the water is a little bit cloudy. That means that the yeast has been dispersed through the water. Now, this package that you got from me, you can reseal this package and you can put this in your freezer for up to 6 months, or you can put this in the fridge and have it, you could make lots of starts from this. In the book, The Art of Baking with Natural Yeast, that Melissa Richardson and I co-wrote, it says you need to use a 1/4 cup, but that is not, we know now that that's no longer true. We were trying to make it uniform in the book, but you can take even the tiniest amount. You don't need a 1/4 cup. I promise you it works. I've done it many, many, many times. Now again, once you have the water and the yeast sort of mixed together, we're going to add a little bit of flour, and we're just going to stir this together until it forms something resembling a thick pancake batter. And it's really important that you get it to be a thick pancake batter consistency, because if you have not enough flour in here, then it will just, the water, there will be too much water for the flour, and the water will just rise to the top and turn brown and begin to oxidize. So it's important that you learn how, without measuring, how to eyeball and discover how much water and flour you should be mixing together. If you give a person a recipe, you may feed them once, but if you teach them how to read the natural language of yeast and dough, then you can feed generations. And you can see that this falls pretty quickly off of the spoon, or off of the spatula. I might even just add a little bit more to that, because I think that's, and I mean just a little bit. You don't want to add too much. But we want this to be fairly thick. I'm just mixing this together, and then you'll be able to see that this is going to fall slowly off of the spatula, which is exactly the consistency that we want for mixing yeast. And so now you'll just take this and put a loose lid on it, and we'll clean it up a little bit here. Put a loose lid on it and leave that on your counter just like the other one until it forms bubbles of all kinds. This one's going to go a lot faster because that yeast was live and not dried. So even within 6 hours, depending on the temperature of your house, it's going to be filled with bubbles of all sizes like this, which is what you want. And when it's filled with bubbles like this, then the yeast has been eating the gluten in here, which you can learn about in another video that I have. And now this begins to be gluten-free flour, even though it's natural flour, because, as I discussed in the other video, the yeasts, our natural yeast, eats the gluten found in wheat. So that's what, once it's filled full of bubbles of any sizes, then you know that it's time to use in one of the recipes for baking bread or pancakes or waffles or muffins or whatever you want to make. So those are your options. Again, you can go to seedrenaissance.com. Now, if you have, once you've got a jar full of yeast, let's say we've got a jar full of yeast and it's ready to go, then you'll be taking the yeast out of the jar so that you can cook with it. And I just leave the residue, and I suggest that you also just leave the residue. Scrape the jar out, because over time, it's important to remember that once the yeast is done eating the flour, it will begin to turn sour. So we don't want it to be sour. We want it to be sweet. So it's important that we leave enough yeast in the jar to start a new batch, but not enough yeast in the jar to make it too sour. So if you can see that, I just have left a residue in the jar. Then I'm just going to put a little bit of water in, depending on, if I'm making bread, I only need a little bit of this, and if I'm making pancakes or waffles, then I'll probably want more. So I'll just swirl that water around until it turns a little bit murky. That means that the yeast is now disseminated throughout there. And then add some flour, just like we did with the other jars. Add some flour and stir the flour in so that it's completely mixed together. And this is going to need a little bit more flour. And again, I think it's really important that you learn how to eyeball this without doing a recipe, because if you're going to rely on the recipe, it's important to know that if you have a bag of flour and you get a cup of flour from the top, you might get 1 cup of flour from the top, but it's going to be lighter because it hasn't been compacted down. Then if you get 1 cup of flour from the bottom where it is compacted down, these are going to weigh, even though the volume is 1 cup for each of them, the weight is going to be significantly heavier on the bottom, which is why so many people are having trouble trying to mix their flours together. Professional, or not mix their yeasts together. Professional bakers actually weigh their flour. Most home cooks don't have the equipment to weigh their flour, and so it's important, if you cannot weigh your flour, to be able to eyeball it to know what is correct. So you just keep adding flour until you have something that's going to slowly and thickly fall off of the spatula, and that's the perfect consistency for starting a new batch of yeast. And then once you have this all mixed together like this, just like the other jars, you can set this on the counter and leave it until it's filled full of bubbles. As soon as it is filled full of bubbles, you can use it immediately by scraping it out of the jar, or you can put it in the fridge and leave it for several days until you're ready to use it. Either way, whenever you're done, you just come scrape it out again. When you're ready to use it, scrape it out. Whether it's been in the fridge or it's been on the counter, scrape it out, use the yeast, and then leave the residue and feed it. And in this way, you never have to purchase yeast again for the rest of your life, because you have yeast, you have a perpetual start of natural baking yeast with all of the health benefits that comes with that. So thank you for watching the video. If you have questions, you can email them to me at calebwarnock@yahoo.com. And I will, if there are further questions, I'll try to make another video to address those. So thank you for joining me for this YouTube video, everyone, and bake with health. Please click now to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks, everyone.